Chapter 16 of Mystery of the Ambush in India by Andy Adams. The Bamboo Bridge. Biff and the three boys with him started forward on the run to meet Charles Keene and his companions. They soon saw that one of the pair was Lee, and since the other was about his size, it only took one guess for Biff to name him. Chubba! But by the time the two groups met, Biff had another name in mind as well. The first words he put were, "Where's Muscles? Wasn't he along with you?" "Muscles is all right," Charles Keene assured him. "We are too, but we had to speed up our pace the last few miles, otherwise we wouldn't have made it. When I get a cup of hot coffee, I'll tell you all about it." Lee and Chubba were just too winded to talk at all. When they reached the caravan, Barma Shah decided to delay the start until they had rested. That gave Charles Keene time to tell their story. He related how clouds had enveloped their plane high in the Himalayas. "Rather than hit a mountain," he said, "we chanced a landing in a valley. Fortunately, it was a deep one, and the fog hadn't fully settled. All of a sudden, green fields smacked right up at us. We banged up the plane some, but not too badly. What happened next was the odd part." Charles Keene paused to drink half his cup of coffee in one long, grateful swallow. Meanwhile, Lee and Chubba couldn't wait to pick the story up from there. "A lot of natives wearing goatskins came rushing up to the plane," declared Lee. "We thought they were going to mob us." "They were shouting, 'Yeti, Yeti,' over and over," put in Chubba. "But before we could find out what they meant, Muscles went after them. You should have seen them run." Charles Keene laid aside his empty cup. "Later they came creeping back," he said, "and we made friends with them, so we didn't ask what they meant by shouting." He stopped suddenly as Barma Shah made frantic gestures for silence. A Ladakhi porter was standing by, staring with dark, narrowed eyes. Barma Shah told the man to bring some more hot coffee. Then, when he was gone, Barma Shah confided, "Don't mention the word Yeti to these people. You have heard of the giant ape-man of the Himalayas, haven't you? The creature they call the abominable snowman. That's their name for it, Yeti." "I remember now," exclaimed Charles Keene. "I was sure I'd heard the word before, but I thought that yarn was spiked long ago." "Not in these mountains," rejoined Barma Shah. "Here in Ladakh, as well as Kashmir, Sikkim, Bhutan, Nepal, Tibet, and even as far away as Yarkand, the Yeti is very real. The natives will run away if they even think such a creature is around." "And we thought they meant the plane," exclaimed Lee. "Yes, because we came down from the sky like a big bird," added Chubba. "Bigger than they ever saw before." "They may have blamed the Yeti for bringing such a monster," commented Barma Shah. "But here comes the porter with the coffee, so let us avoid the word from now on." "But where is Muscles?" queried Biff. "Back in the valley, looking after the plane," explained his uncle. "Some of the tribesmen, Sherpas they call themselves, guided us over the mountain pass and then returned to their valley. We miscalculated slightly or we would have been here sooner." Despite the delay, the caravan completed its next stage ahead of the impending snowstorm. The patient yaks, creatures that resembled both the ox and the American buffalo, with long hair like the fleece of a sheep, responded to continued prodding as though they recognized the need for hurry. Tix, the chief porter and head yak driver, had a comment on that score. "Listen and you hear yak grunt," he told the boys. "That means two things." "And what are those?" asked Biff. "One thing, yak like what happened, yes. Other thing, yak do not like what happened, no." "And how," queried Mike, "do you tell the grunts apart?" "No way to tell," replied Tix. "Yak grunt the same exactly, whichever way he feel, but it is important just the same." "And what makes it so important," demanded Lee, "if you don't know the difference?" "You do know the difference," returned Tix. "When yak give grunt, he feel one way or other, maybe both. When yak do not give grunt, yak do not care." "But why," asked Chubba, "should yaks feel both good and bad?" "These yaks feel good," explained Tix, "because they know they get to shelter ahead of snow. They feel bad because we make them hurry, so they say both things with one grunt. Simple." It looked simple indeed when they reached the day's goal, a small patch of grazing ground where dry grass spread to the foot of rocky slopes. There were stone huts for the members of the party and similar shelters for the yaks. The reason stones had been used in the construction was because there were plenty of them lying around, and nothing else. The roofs of the buildings were made of rough boards, covered with thatched leaves. They weren't nailed down because they didn't have to be. The builders had simply placed big stones on the roofs. The boys turned in early and slept late, snug in their sleeping bags and shoulder to shoulder in their huts. In the morning it took 3 of them to ram the door open. The snow was so deep. But the yaks were up, ready and grunting, some because they liked snow, others because they hated it. The yaks pulled the party through. They bulldozed their way through the snow chest deep, clearing it like living snowplows, so that the people had no difficulty following them. Oddly, as the trail climbed higher, it led to barren ground, totally free from snow. Apparently the storm clouds hadn't managed to gain that altitude. Early that afternoon, the party halted at a roaring mountain stream and stared at the remnants of a crude wooden bridge that had been washed away by the flood. Sadly, Tix petted one yak after another, while the porters relieved the stolid beasts of their burdens. The boys watched Tix turn the yaks over to 2 other Ladakhis, who promptly drove them off along the trail. Barma Shah explained the situation. "We'll have to make a footbridge," he stated, "before the water rises too high. So Tix is sending the yaks on to another shelter. From now on, the porters will carry our packs." All the while, Biff could hear a chopping sound from a short way up the narrow, turbulent stream. There was a sudden crash, and a tree came toppling down to bridge the raging torrent. Chandra appeared from the brush, carrying a heavy hand axe. "Bridge already set," reported Chandra. "It just needs one thing more." "It needs much more." The interruption came from a squatty, broadly built porter named Hurdu, as he tested the tree with a clumsy foot. "We need 10 more trees like this." "We need a rail for the bridge," declared Chandra calmly. "Can somebody bring me a rope?" Biff supplied a rope, and Chandra hitched one end around a tree. Like a monkey, he scrambled across the fallen tree, carrying the free end of the rope with him. A single slip and Chandra would have gone into the flood, which probably would have pleased Hurdu, who was watching intently. But Chandra was across in no time and promptly hitched the rope to a tree on the opposite bank, drawing it taut as he did. "Now walk across log bridge," called Chandra, "and hold on to rope rail." Biff shouldered a pack and followed instructions, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead, not on the furious current, which would have distracted him. With one hand on the rope, it was simple to steady himself while he advanced one foot, then the other. A dozen steps and he was over. Now the other boys were following his example. That was all the porters needed. They hoisted their full burdens, 80 pounds to a man, and stalked across Chandra's simple bridge in regular procession. Charles Keene and Barma Shah followed, as did Tix and Hurdu, though the last 2 exchanged glares before they started and after they had crossed. Now that the yaks had gone their way, a dispute appeared to be in the making as to who was the chief guide of the party. Both Tix and Hurdu wanted that honor. The narrow path made a steep ascent up the side of a high cliff, and before the porters were out of sight of Chandra's crude bridge, they saw the surging stream carry it away. Time had been the all-important factor where that crossing was concerned. But an hour later, the party came to something much more formidable. The trail swung along the fringe of a tremendous, steep-walled gorge, 1,000 feet in depth and 100 or more across. Down below, a river thundered like a hungry dragon, ready to devour any human prey. Chandra was pleased to see that this chasm was already bridged, for he could have done nothing with his hand axe. The bridge was of a suspension type, so crude and flimsy of construction that it seemed to hover in mid-air. Yet it evidently was strong enough, for Barma Shah, who was up in front, started across without hesitation. Tix and Hurdu were close behind him, followed by the long procession of porters with their heavy packs. As Biff paused to look for the other boys, he found Chubba close beside him. As usual, Chubba had a saying to fit the situation. "Tix and Hurdu agree on something at last," declared Chubba. "Wise man never argue when it prove another man right." "You've got something there," laughed Biff, as he watched Tix and Hurdu practically crowd each other across the bridge. Neither could afford to hesitate, or he'd be admitting that the other was boss. "From the look of that bridge," observed Li, "both were lucky to get across. The same goes for us, if we make it." Considering that the bridge cables were composed of twisted strands of bamboo and rattan, with hanging vines dangling like ropes to support the roadway, Li had a point. But the other boys didn't agree. They had seen and crossed many such primitive bridges. Chubba in Burma, Chandra in India, Kamuka in Brazil, and Mike in Mexico. Though the porters crossed at a safe distance apart, they didn't begin to tax the bridge to its capacity. That was proven when the boys reached the bridge and saw that its runway, fashioned from strips of bamboo laid crosswise, was wide enough to drive a yak across. As the boys crossed the bridge two abreast, Biff spoke to Chandra, who was beside him. "Now I see why Hurdu wanted to chop down more trees back at the little stream. We could have brought the yaks along. Why wasn't Tix in favor of that?" "I saw Tix pet the yaks and say goodbye," returned Chandra. "He made grunts like yak, saying he was both glad and sorry. Sorry because the yaks had to go, glad because it gave jobs to porters instead." "You're right," exclaimed Biff. "Colonel Gorak said the bearers were not to receive full pay until they actually took over." The tremendous roar of water echoed up from the steep walled gorge, drowning further conversation until the boys were across. It might have been imagination, but Biff felt that the bridge quivered as he left it, so he turned to look back, while Chandra, still beside him, was laying his pack on solid ground. They had come between a pair of upright posts that served as tower for the bridge. Now they were close by the big stakes to which the rope cables were moored. There, porters were stacking their packs by dozens and sitting down to rest. There were still several porters on the bridge, all well spaced. Behind them came Li and Chubba, for those two boys had stayed back to wait for Charles Keene, who was bringing up the rear. Biff's uncle had taken on that duty to keep the parade moving, as he styled it, which meant that he had been encouraging straggling porters in his own cheery, breezy way. Li and Chubba were past the halfway mark and Uncle Charlie was almost there when Biff saw the swaying bridge give a sudden shudder. Biff thought for an instant that it was an earth tremor. Then he noticed that the porters near him were chatting, quite unconcerned. Biff gave a warning shout, too late. With a snap like a rifle report, the rope parted from the stake at Biff's right. With it, the entire cable slipped on that side of the bridge, tilting the runway downward. In a single second, Charles Keene, Li, Chubba, and a pair of porters were sprawling on the slippery bamboo slats, which had suddenly become a chute to certain doom in the abyss below. Chapter 17. The Monster of the Mountains. In the harrowing moments that followed, Biff saw two shapes go slithering off the slanted bridge and continue spinning, tumbling in huddled, helpless fashion into the gaping jaws of the roaring gorge. Biff shut his eyes as they disappeared, and his mind flashed back to those tiny figures that he had seen against the snowy background of the mountain pass. Uncle Charlie, Li, and Chubba. The boys were two of a size, like those two forms that had just plunged from the collapsing bridge. So they must be Li and Chubba, or else the two porters. But no, not the porters. Those somersaulting shapes weren't big enough. Biff tightened his fist grimly as he opened his eyes for one last hopeless look. Biff was right. It wasn't the porters. At the first warning quiver of the bridge, they had dropped their heavy burdens and made a desperate dive for safety. Nearly across, first one, then the other, had managed to grab the high edge of the canted runway and scramble to the ground beyond. But as Biff looked past them, his eyes opened really wide. It wasn't Li or Chubba either. Both boys were still there, near the center of the bridge, with Uncle Charlie. The moment the bridge had tilted one way and they had felt themselves sliding with it, all three had made a frantic grab in the other direction. Instinctively, they had gripped the upper side of the slender grass ropes that supported it. They were still hanging on. What Biff had seen tumble into the gorge were the bulky packs that the porters had flung aside. Those bulging burdens, when falling, had looked exactly like a pair of huddled humans. Now, Uncle Charlie and the two boys were lightening weight by letting their own packs follow the path of the others. That still didn't guarantee them safety. The whole weight of the bridge was now swaying on a single rope cable. Sooner or later it was sure to snap, then all hope of rescue would be gone. Now, chunks of the runway were breaking loose from the dangling ropes, which no longer bore their proportionate shares of the weight. That produced a new dilemma. It was impossible for Uncle Charlie, Li, and Chobber to work their way along that upper edge because of the gaps. They would have to reach the one remaining cable, climb it to the top of the tower post, and come down to the ground. Li and Chobber might manage it, but not Charles Keene with all his weight. Chandra had the answer. He had brought along the rope from his log bridge. He tossed one end to Biff, saying, "Hang on tight." Then, carrying the other end, Chandra scrambled up the lone cable and practically slid from the post top out to where Li and Chubba clung. There, Chandra, Li, and Chubba tied their rope end to the cable, while Biff, Mike, and Kamuka hauled the rope taut and hitched the other end around the tower post. That filled the gaps along the level route to safety. Chandra went first, pausing to tie dangling liana strands to the new rope to keep it from sagging. Li and Chubba followed, stopping to wait for Charles Keene even when he twisted one arm in the rope and waved them on with his other hand. If Biff's uncle tired, they hoped to help him, but what Uncle Charlie lacked in agility, he made up for in endurance. After minutes that proved long and nerve-wracking for Biff and his watching companions, the other boys reached solid ground with Charles Keene right behind them. A moment later, Biff and the rest were swarming around Uncle Charlie and congratulating him, while Barma Shah spoke approvingly. "That was very good indeed, and just in time too. The wind is getting brisker from the gorge. What is left of the bridge will soon be gone." At a combined order from Tix and Hurdu, the bearers gathered their packs. Then they were on their way again. As they veered away from the gorge, Biff took a last look back. The remains of the bridge were swinging like a hammock now, its single strand due to snap at any moment. Chandra, who was walking beside Biff, touched his arm. "The rope, Biff," he said in a low voice. "Somebody cut it." Biff stared at him. "Are you sure?" he gasped. When Chandra nodded, Biff said soberly, "Then that means there's an enemy right in our own party." That evening, when they had pitched their tents in the shelter of some trees on the rim of a rugged valley, Charles Keene remarked, "Losing a few packs didn't hurt us because we were short on porters anyway." "Short on porters?" inquired Barma Shah. "How?" "We had 60 yesterday morning, but there were only 54 when I counted them as they crossed the log bridge. That's why I brought up the rear, to see that no more of them skipped." That news brought a grim expression to Barma Shah's face. In response, he said, "They may have heard our talk of Yeti. What is more, I saw some big tracks in the snow before we broke camp yesterday. I obliterated them, but perhaps some of the porters saw them first." That night it snowed again, though only lightly. In the morning, Biff awoke to hear the camp babbling with excitement. He crawled from his sleeping bag and emerged from the tent, where he promptly ran into Chandra, who told him, "Yeti tracks again. Hurdu found them on the hill." Biff joined Charles Keene and Barma Shah up near some barren rocks. The tracks were much larger than a man's foot, but clumsy and roughly formed. They led in from the rocks, then back again, as though some creature had come down from the craggy hill toward the camp, only to return to its lair. Some of the Ladakhi bearers were gabbing among themselves and repeating, "Yeti, Yeti," much too often, as they walked along beside the big footprints and compared them with their own smaller tracks. Back at camp, Barma Shah conferred with Tix, who gave the porters a pep talk in a mixture of Hindi and Ladakhi. They responded in grunts of half agreement as they gathered up their packs. "Those sound like yak grunts," declared Chuba. "Good and bad. They don't want to go along, but anyway, they go." "That is right," stated Chandra, who had caught the meaning of the speech. "Tix says they have to go along because they can't go back, as there is no bridge across the gorge." That night, the porters pitched their tents much closer together when they camped. There was another light snow, and in the morning, Hurdu found new Yeti tracks beside a rocky slope nearby. Charles Keene was frankly skeptical about them. "Anybody could have made them with a piece of brushwood," Biff's uncle declared, "or in half a dozen other ways, but I guess Tix can't convince his crowd of that." "Tix thinks they are Yeti tracks himself," returned Barma Shah. "That is the real trouble." All day, the Ladakhi porters kept watching the barren ground above the tree line, for that was the high altitude at which the Yetis supposedly dwelled. They quickened their pace and reached the next campsite well before dusk. There, trouble seemed over, for this was a valley where two trails crossed, and already a nomadic tribe was camped there. They greeted the party from Leh and gladly sold them fresh provisions. That night, there was music and mirth around the campfires. The morning dawned crisp but pleasant, for there was no sign of any snow. Nor was there any sign of Tix or his Ladakhi porters. They had pulled out at dawn, taking the other trail the long way back to Leh, leaving only Hurdu and a dozen others who were not Ladakhi. That automatically promoted Hurdu to chief guide, and when he suggested hiring some of the nomad tribesmen as porters, Barma Shah favored the idea, but asked for approval from Charles Keene as joint leader of the expedition. Biff's uncle was all for Hurdu's suggestion. "They look to me like Sherpas," he declared, "like those friendly chaps we met in the valley where we landed our plane." "They are not Sherpas," put in Chuba politely. "I listened to their talk, Sahib Keene. They call themselves Changpas. They do not come from the south, but from the north." "That means they are not Nepalese," stated Barma Shah, "but Tibetans. They are accustomed to these high altitudes perhaps better than those who live in Ladakh or Nepal. What is more," he lowered his voice, "they have probably heard less about the Yeti." "Then let's hire them quickly," returned Charles Keene, with a knowing smile, "before they can change their minds." Hurdu hired the Changpa bearers, and the march was resumed. But the nomads, though sturdier than the old crew from Leh, lacked their steady-going qualities. They paused frequently to rest and eat, even hinting that they might drop their packs and quit. So Barma Shah told Hurdu to cut the day's trek short as soon as they reached a suitable campsite. That went on for 3 days, which pleased Biff and the other boys, as it gave them more time to roam at large. They had found little to talk about with the porters from Leh, but this Changpa crew were mostly hunters. They had brought throwing spears as well as bows and arrows, and at every halt, they let the boys try the weapons. On the 4th morning, Biff awoke to find more snow on the ground. Nobody else was up, for the carefree Changpas were late risers. Glancing off beyond the camp, Biff saw something that riveted him. Going back into the tent, Biff wakened the nearest boy, who happened to be Chandra. Motioning for silence, Biff whispered, "Yeti tracks, come on." Chandra came, bringing his trusty hand axe. Biff nodded approval and promptly borrowed a throwing spear that was standing outside a Changpa tent. He then led Chandra to the first of the marks that he had noticed in the snow. They looked like footprints and big ones, half the size of snowshoe tracks. Breathless, Chandra gestured back toward the camp. "Maybe we better call others." "Not yet," returned Biff. "Let's see where these lead. Then we can plan ahead before everybody gets excited." The tracks led up the slope, but instead of ending there, they followed a snow-covered ledge. Beyond that was a huge, chunky rock, and as Biff glanced in that direction, he saw a great tawny figure with a shock of thick black hair as it bounded from cover. Then it was gone among another cluster of rocks. Biff was after it, beckoning Chandra along, and they saw the thing again as it sprang to another snowy ledge. There it dropped to all fours, and by the time the boys reached the ledge, it was gone again, but its footprints showed in the patchy snow. The two boys passed a slight turn where the rocks rose like jagged steps, tufted with snow. As Chandra started in that direction, Biff noticed an arched gap in the jagged wall that rose beside the ledge itself. Biff turned and called, "Wait, Chandra! There's a cave here. Maybe that's where he went." Chandra looked back, and his face froze with horror. He was too startled even to shout a warning, but the look in his eyes, which were staring straight past Biff, told enough. Instinctively, Biff wheeled about, then recoiled as he turned his eyes upwards. From the cleft in the rocky wall loomed a tremendous hulk of reddish-brown. Tiny eyes were glaring above wide-open, long-toothed jaws, while massive, sharp-clawed paws clamped downward, inward, toward the boy's dodging form. Biff Brewster was all but in the grip of a gigantic Tibetan bear, one of the most dangerous creatures that roved those rocky heights. Chapter 18: The Frozen Waterfall. All that saved Biff at that moment was the Changa spear that he had snatched from outside a tent. He had the weapon in his hand, and as he dodged, he jabbed the spear point at the creature from the cave. It was puny compared to the bear's bulk, but it bothered the big beast. Clumsily, the bear batted aside the jabs, and that diverted its action. Biff now had time to dive away. He flung the spear as he went, but it flew wide. Hardly had it clattered on the rocks before another weapon whizzed past the bear's head. Chandra's hand axe. Like Biff, Chandra timed his throw too late. The bear was already dropping on all fours, about to lope after Biff. Biff saw that in a glance and began thinking fast. Bears, though clumsy, could move swiftly and would attack if angered, which this one evidently was. Tibetan bears were death on yaks and sheep. That Biff had also heard. Maybe they'd keep coming after them on ledges like this, so there was no use acting like a sheep or a yak. Biff halted suddenly and flattened himself against the rocky wall, ready to reverse direction if the bear came bounding past. On the contrary, if it reared, Biff intended to be off again, and while waiting that moment of decision, he took a quick look down toward the campsite. That proved smart indeed. Instead of the area being all but deserted with everyone asleep, it literally teemed with action. Uncle Charlie and Barma Shah were coming up the slope armed with rifles, and followed by half a dozen Changpa tribesmen, all with bows and arrows. All the other boys were coming too, apparently shouting as loudly as they could, but the wind was against them, which was why Biff hadn't heard them. They were gesturing, though, and that he understood. Wildly, all were waving for him to keep going along the ledge. That Biff would have done anyway, for just now the bear had arrived and was rearing for another lunge. So Biff took off again, hoping that the ledge would lead somewhere. That wasn't necessary. From behind him came the ping of bullets as they hit the ledge, followed by the boom of the actual gunshots from below. Biff darted another quick look and saw arrows coming down from the sky, with the rearing bear as their target. The bear hadn't budged from its last position, except to set itself up for the marksman. Suddenly bristling with arrows, it toppled, rolled sideways and fell from sight over the ledge. Everybody took credit for the kill, which they had a right to do. Uncle Charlie had fired half a dozen shots and was sure that at least 2 had landed. Barma Shah quietly showed Biff his rifle, which still had a special gadget fitted above the barrel. This time, Barma Shah confided, it was a telescopic sight. I only used the flashlight beam at night. As for the Changpa marksmen, there were 6 of them, and there were 6 arrows in the dead bear. They knew which arrow was whose, because all had identifying marks. They chattered among themselves, each claiming that his shaft had been the best. They were still at it after their comrades had carved the bear into steaks for the evening dinner at the next campsite. That pleased Barma Shah because nobody was interested in the Yeti tracks anymore. He mentioned this fact to Hurdu, who interpreted it to the Changpas thus: "You see what fools the Ladakhi are? Day after day they see tracks in the snow and think they are Yeti footprints. Instead, they are just bear tracks. The big bear followed, hoping people have yaks that bear can kill and eat. Instead, people kill bear and eat it. But people who kill bear are Shangpas, not Ladakhi. When they stopped for a noonday meal, the Changpa bowman was still arguing whose arrow had killed the big bear. While the other boys were watching and quietly getting a wallop out of the pantomime, Chandra drew Biff aside and asked, "Who do you think really killed the bear?" "Uncle Charlie fired a lot of shots," replied Biff, "and he may have made some hits. After all, we didn't dig the bullets out of the carcass. But I know, and you know, that Barma Shah is a terrific marksman." "This is true," interposed Chandra, "but Barma Shah did not kill the bear. The Yeti did." Biff stared, amazed. "We saw Yeti," said Chandra, "didn't we?" "We saw something go hopping up to the ledge," conceded Biff. "But when we got there, out popped the big bear." "From the cave, yes, but I saw Yeti keep going up by rocks above." "So you said, Chandra, but are you sure?" "Sure, I am sure. Because the number one shot that killed the bear, it came from up there. Afterward, there was much shooting, but first the bear had gone like this." Chandra gave a perfect imitation of the way the bear had stiffened on the cliff, so Biff decided not to argue it. "You may be right," he told Chandra, "but let's keep it to ourselves. The Yeti is supposed to be right smart, maybe more man than ape, but to class him as an expert rifleman, well, people just wouldn't go for it. You go for it, Biff?" "I might go for anything, Chandra." Biff let it go at that because his own recollections of what had happened on the ledge were somewhat confused, so he could allow for a few mistakes on Chandra's part. Besides, there was more important things to think about. The most important of all was brought up in an odd way when they pitched camp late that same afternoon. Biff heard Li and Kamuka begin one of their old arguments, while the other boys gleefully listened in. "Well, Kamuka," commented Li in an indulgent tone, "now that you're high in the Himalayas, how do the Andes stack up?" "Still bigger," returned Kamuka. "Anyway, they look bigger. That's what's most important." Kamuka looked for someone to agree, and he received an approving nod from Chuba. "But there are things here that you won't find in the Andes," Li went on. "For instance," he caught himself when Biff gave him a warning glance. Instead of mentioning Yetis, Li made a quick switch. "For instance, we have llamas. You don't have people like that in the Andes." "Sure we do," rejoined Kamuka, "only they don't look like people. They look like yaks." That brought a laugh from Biff, in which Mike joined. Chandra and Chuba were still puzzled, so Biff explained. "Li means a llama, spelled with one L, like Li. The llamas are important people. We are on our way to see one now. But Kamuka is talking about llamas, spelled with a double L. They are animals that carry packs in the Andes, as yaks do here." Biff left it to Mike to go into further details on the subject, while he went over to talk to Uncle Charlie and Barma Shah. Biff put a simple question. "How are we going to find Chauncey?" Biff asked them. "When will we hear from the Grand Lama, the wisest man in the East?" "I don't know," began Barma Shah, "unless—" His eyes narrowed as he spoke. He was looking off towards the nearest mountain pass, and Biff, following his gaze, saw a tiny figure coming toward them at a jog trot. "What is it?" Biff asked anxiously. Not a Yeti?" "No, no." Barma Shah had raised a pair of binoculars and was studying the approaching man. "It is a long ompa, a special kind of runner, who carries messages from one lama to another. A long ompa can keep up that pace all day." "And he may have a message for us?" "Very possibly." The rangy long ompa never slackened speed until he pulled into the camp. There, in some uncanny fashion, he picked out the leaders of the party. But when he approached Barma Shah and Charles Keene, he did not hand them the envelope he carried. Instead, he gave it to Biff. Then, with a faraway stare, the runner started off again, oblivious to everything, including the weather. for despite the freezing temperature, he wore only a simple goatskin and a pair of open sandals. Biff opened the envelope and brought out a sheet of parchment which proved to be a map. He showed it to Uncle Charlie and Barma Shah. Together they studied it in the firelight, for it was now dusk. The map puzzled them completely until Charles Keene declared, "I don't get it. Somebody has drawn what looks like a streak of lightning." "That's it, the place of living thunder," Barma Shah exclaimed. He brought out another map and spread it in the firelight. It showed the whole course that the party had followed. Near the present campsite was a zigzag line, exactly like the one on the parchment, but on a smaller scale. "It is a chasm a mile deep," explained Barma Shah, "but only half that distance across. Nobody has ever gone there because it is supposed to be impassable." He traced a dotted line on the long Ompus chart. "It must lead to the lost city of Chauncey. No wonder no one has ever found it. We'll start for there tomorrow." They were off to an early start the next morning and soon were among scenes of grandeur that surpassed any so far encountered. Narrow valleys filled with odd, colorful flowers formed a contrast to the snow-topped peaks that loomed high above. Then abruptly the trail reached the brim of a deep, granite-walled canyon. Nearby was a cluster of trees indicated on the parchment map. A dotted line began from there, so the party moved into the grove. There they were halted by a big rock until the boys probed the underbrush around it and found stone steps leading downward. Soon the whole procession was following a dizzy trail chiseled into the canyon wall. Barma Shah had been right regarding its depth. It was at least a mile and perhaps more. The vast gulch followed a zigzag as shown on the map, and as they steadily descended, the brim of the gorge was totally lost from view due to the narrowing of the walls. Then the zigzag sharpened, and on their own side of the gorge, they saw a fascinating sight. Through an opening in the granite poured what looked like a mammoth waterfall, except that it was utterly motionless. At the bottom, half a mile beneath, was a vast, glassy mass, pockmarked by thousands of huge stones. "An icefall!" exclaimed Charles Keene. "A stream of water, frozen solid, pouring down to a glacier below." As he spoke, they saw a chunk of ice and rock drop from the brink and slide out along the graceful frozen curve until it dropped straight down and struck the glacier. Then came a rising echo that reverberated through the gorge like a long roll of thunder. When the sound finally died away, Barma Shah said coolly, "That is why they call it the place of living thunder. People have heard that roar from the brink above, but we are the first to see what caused it, except for those who live in the valley." Their course brought them to the huge icefall. This time Charles Keene and Barma Shah led the way together, followed by Hurdu and Tibetan bearers, with Biff and the boys bringing up the rear. The path seemed a very safe one, being hewn in the solid rock. Granite steps took them upward to the overhanging curve of the giant icefall. Above that, a bridge of large stepping stones crossed the whitish flowing mass. Biff, in the lead, leaped to the first stone and felt it quiver. He should have turned back, but instead he tried to jump onto the next. The first stone suddenly went from under him, spilling Biff backward. Mike, who had reached the top of the steps, grabbed for Biff's hand and caught it with both of his own. Then Mike was swept off balance by the force of Biff's slide. Both would have gone skimming over the brink, except that Chuba and Kamuka, coming next, were in time to catch Mike's ankles and hold them. They hadn't the strength to pull the pair back, and Biff, from his precarious position, realized why. That curving brink of perpetual ice was so smooth that it offered nothing in the way of a hold, not even the slightest amount of friction. Slowly, surely, the drag would bring all four along, unless someone's hold gave out. In any case, Biff Brewster would be the first to slide out over that fatal curve and plunge the half-mile to the glacier below. Chapter 19 The Lost City. From his hopeless perch, Biff heard Kamuka and Chuba shouting up above. "Come on, you fellows," they yelled. "Lend a hand." They were calling to Li and Chandra, who were still coming up the granite steps, but it was useless. Biff and Mike represented too much dead weight, even for all four. Mike had Biff's wrist in a powerful grip. They were face to face as Biff looked up and said, "You'll have to let go, Mike. They may be able to haul you back, but not both of us." "It's both," gritted Mike, "or neither." "But you'll only be dragging the others along too. Can't you understand?" "No," Mike grinned grimly as he was jolted upward. Then, as he slipped back downward, he added, "Yes." Mike realized that Li had joined Chuba and Kamuka, that with Li's helping hand they had managed a temporary lift, only to lose what little they had gained. But Mike still gripped Biff. "Chandra will be helping them next," Mike said reassuringly. "With four pulling, it will make a difference." "Yes, I've managed to hold on a little longer," groaned Biff. "But it can't change things, Mike. They still can haul you up if you'll only let go." "Only I won't let go." A sharp sound was beating through Biff's brain. It came, crack, 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 in deadly monotone. He imagined he heard a new voice too, Chandra's voice saying, "I'll be there, Biff." Then came the crack, crack, and again, "I'll be there." Closer, it seemed, and just below. For the first time, Biff steeled his nerve and looked down. Chandra was there, on the curving brink itself, hanging to the ice where it was steeper than the spot where Biff himself was stretched. In his hand, Chandra held his axe, which he had retrieved after hurling it at the bear. With it, he was chopping into the ice, making those crack, crack sounds. Chandra hadn't gone up the steps to join the boys above. Instead, he had hacked steps of his own into the fringe of the ice fall. He'd made enough to gain hand and toe holds for himself. Working up from those at an outward angle, he had literally chopped the slanted ladder, climbing it as he did. Now he was denting the ice beside Biff's right ankle. That done, he shoved Biff's right foot into place. Biff shifted his weight in that direction. Instantly, the strain on Mike lessened just enough for him to open his half-closed eyes and stare downward in wonder. Crack, crack, crack. There was a toehold for Biff's left foot now. That really eased the strain, for Mike's body immediately moved up a bit, pulled by the boys above. Chandra kept hacking more steps, higher. Biff kept climbing the new ones, leaving the old to Chandra, who promptly followed. Then, suddenly, Mike was up to safety, and they were hauling Biff up too, when he gasped, "Wait, I'm bringing Chandra too." So Biff was, for by now Chandra was tiring. He clung to Biff's leg with one hand and kept chopping steps with the other, just enough to work himself up. Then hands from above gripped Chandra and he and Biff were hauled up side by side. Kamuka found a board from an old catwalk and used it to bridge the gap across the missing stepping stone. One by one, the boys crossed the frozen stream above the mammoth ice fall. They found steps on the other side and descended for nearly half a mile before they overtook the party. Charles Keene, Barma Shah, Hurdu, and all the rest were waiting on a great, wide lookout platform, viewing a stupendously breathtaking scene. There, set in a tremendous niche across the mile-deep gorge, was the lost city of Chauncey. There were small stone huts in the foreground. These, if seen from straight above, would look like nothing more than rock heaps. But the pride of Chauncey, the palace of the Grand Lama, rose above a towering array of great stone steps and castellated walls, forming tier after tier of magnificent buildings to a height of nearly 500 feet, only to be dwarfed by the more tremendous mass of the cliff that overhung it. From the top of the great gorge, it would be impossible even to glimpse this hidden wonder of the Himalayas in the massive hollow that had been hewn to contain it. Yet its relation to the gorge was such that sunlight streamed down into this secret setting during a good proportion of the day. Barma Shah summed it up when he stated, "There is an old saying, as long as the Himalayas stand, so will Chauncey. Now I understand its meaning. If that cliff should tumble, the city would fall too." Amazed at the sight of the stupendous citadel, Biff did not tell his Uncle Charlie and Barma Shah about his near plunge from the icefall. Instead, he reminded them of his mission. "The sooner we get over there, the quicker we will find my father." Both men agreed, but Barma Shah added, "You will have to see the Grand Lama first." That was the part that worried Biff most, though he didn't say so. Now that he was practically at his goal, he felt shakier than ever, for the Chomsky Lama now represented power on a vast scale, considering the size of his secret stronghold. The party continued down the granite trail, which zigzagged to the bottom of the canyon, and there crossed a deep but narrow stream on a bridge of simple logs. At the other side they came to a great wall, where the gates were being swung wide to receive them. They were ushered in by lesser lamas and other dignitaries, all wearing robes and costumes of an ancient day. With Hurdu and the porters following, they were conducted up outer steps, then deep beneath a portico and up more steps until they reached a magnificently tiled inner courtyard, where they were bowed to rows of benches. An elderly lama approached and gestured to Biff as he said, "You may come." Next, he addressed Charles Keene and Barma Shah. "You, too, may follow." Then to the boys, "And you next." Pausing, he looked toward the porters and asked, "Any of these?" Barma Shah decided to bring Hurdu and 3 others, so, in the order as arranged, they entered another portico and climbed a short flight of gilded steps into a reception room also decorated in gold. There, Biff was told that he was to enter the throne room of the Grand Lama alone, while Charles Keene and Barma Shah were to be ready when summoned. Golden doors were opening when Uncle Charlie whispered to Biff, "Remember, you're meeting one of the wisest men in the East, as I can now believe. Pay close attention." To that, Biff nodded. Then, as trumpets blared, he was ushered through the doors, clutching the ruby that he had carried all along as his final passport to the Grand Lama's presence. Then Biff reached a throne where a figure in great golden robes and peaked hat awaited him. On each side stood a solemn dignitary, each in similar robes. One asked in a droning tone, "You have brought the light of the Lama?" Then, as Biff solemnly replied, "Yes," the other dignitary ordered, "Give it to the Great One." No promises, no conditions, no mention of Biff's father. Just hand over the ruby and hope for the best. With a bow, Biff produced a magnificent red gem, which was glowing more vividly than ever. He placed it in the Chonsi Lama's outstretched left hand. Then, hoping to ask the obvious question, he looked up at the Great One. Biff gasped despite himself. Instead of viewing the austere visage of a man in his mid-50s, he was looking into the smiling, friendly face of a boy no older than himself. Still weighing the ruby in his left hand, the Chonsi Lama extended his right in greeting as he said, "Thank you, Biff." Chapter 20. The Master Spy. Before Biff could recover from his astonishment, the Chonsi Lama nodded to one of the men beside him. A moment later, a door opened in the side of the room, and Mr. Brewster entered, as brisk and smiling as when Biff had last seen him. A glad meeting followed. Then, with his arm around Biff's shoulder, Mr. Brewster approached the throne, where the youthful Lama handed him the ruby, saying, "I know you would like to see this, after all you have done to bring it here." Biff suddenly felt very much at home with this boy who was so friendly toward his father. "The ruby is sparkling now," said Biff, "but it changes sometimes and turns dull. That worried Diwan Chand." "Due probably to the setting," observed Mr. Brewster with a smile. "If moisture gets beneath the gem, it detracts from the sparkle, but only temporarily." "I am glad to hear that." The Chonsi Lama smiled as he took back the ruby. "I notice that its glow has lessened, and I do not care for bad omens." As he placed the ruby in his robe, the Chonsi Lama turned to Biff again. "Your father told me much about you," he said. That was one reason why I wanted you to bring the ruby, as it was a good way to meet you. But we weren't quite ready to tell the world that I am now the Chauncey Lama. At last we can declare it." He turned to one of the robed dignitaries. "Usher in the others," he ordered. Then, as an afterthought, he added, "Bring the boys in first." As Biff and his father stepped to one side, Mr. Brewster quietly explained that the former Chauncey Lama had died a few years after his visit to Leh, some 20 years before. "He gave orders to keep his death a secret," explained Biff's father, "until times became less troubled. So a boy who was born at the time the old Lama died was chosen to succeed him. He grew up on the throne, and there he is now. I was as much surprised as you when I met him. More surprises would you." As Biff's friends were ushered in, they looked as awed as Biff had been when he approached the throne. Awe turned to amazement when the boy Lama greeted them each by name and gave them the same winning smile that he had shown Biff. "Bring in the others," the Chauncey Lama ordered, referring to Charles Keene and Barma Shah. He turned to Mr. Brewster. "I shall now officially announce that your mission is complete," he said. "The light of the Lama has been returned. Since it was restored by the present government of India, I shall ally myself with that nation for our mutual advantage. As for the trouble you encountered at the gold mines, it still has puzzling factors." The Chauncey Lama broke off to greet the newcomers who were being ushered in. To Charles Keene, he said cordially, "I know you must be Biff's uncle." Then, turning to the other man, he added, "And you are Barma Shah." Mr. Brewster was coming forward in quick interruption to confront the bland man with the broad face and the wide ears. Biff, accustomed to his father's calm, was surprised to hear Mr. Brewster exclaim excitedly, "Wait, this man is not Barma Shah. He is an impostor. I have never seen him before." "No, I am not Barma Shah," the impostor stated. "But are you sure we haven't met? Don't you remember?" He drew his hands over his ears, pursed his lips and narrowed his eyes to thin slits as he leered mockingly at Biff's father. His complete change of appearance was startling. "The spy we nearly trapped down at the mine," Mr. Brewster exclaimed. "You are Bela Kron, the man who was after the ruby." "Yes, I am Bela Kron," the master spy answered, smiling, "and I took the place of your friend Barma Shah after he was killed in a Calcutta riot of a month ago. Now I am taking over here." Kron, the pretended Barma Shah, was drawing a revolver from his pocket. He had raised his voice, and it must have carried beyond the golden doors, for they suddenly burst open to admit Hurdu and the 3 men with him. No longer were the Changpas carrying bows and arrows. Hurdu had a revolver, and the others were similarly armed. Efficiently, Kron motioned the robed dignitaries to one corner of the throne room, Thomas Brewster and Charles Keene to another, Biff and the boys to a third. That left the youthful Chauncey Lama still on his throne. For how long was a question, though he took the situation calmly. Pleased by the way he and his picked crew had taken over, Bela Kron decided to enlarge upon it. "I started the trouble at the mines," he bragged. "I wanted to acquire the Rajah's ruby as a passport to bring me to this hidden citadel, so I could either make my own terms with the Chauncey Lama or else notify certain foreign factions just where they could find him. Brewster beat me here, but when I learned his son was bringing the ruby, I decided to come along with him." With a mocking look toward Biff, Kron swept his hand around his head, turban fashion, then downward from his chin to indicate a beard. "Remember that Sikh in the bus?" he demanded. "The one with the false beard? I was that Sikh. That's how I picked up your trail. I saw Chandra buy the tickets, and I purposely crossed your path later. For other reasons, I had helped stir the Kali cult into making trouble, but I didn't know they were hot after you. So from then on, I looked out for you, knowing that as Barma Shah, your father's friend and contact, you would bring me here. I saved your life during the tiger hunt and again when the bear was after you. I tried to get rid of your uncle on the bridge because I didn't want him in the way. so I had Hurdu cut the cable. Kron glanced at Hurdu, who shrugged apologetically. Hurdu was slow that time, declared Kron, but he did a good job faking Yeti tracks to scare Tix and his crew clear back to Leh, so we could hire the Changpas who were waiting in the valley where the trails met. It seemed that Bela Kron, the master spy, had called every possible turn, but he had a still bigger trick to play. "My men are stationed in the courtyard below," he declared. "I shall have Hurdu send 2 of his men down and bring the rest up." He waved towards the door, and Hurdu promptly started the 2 men on their way. "Then we shall leave, taking you with us." Kron approached the Chonsi Lama as he spoke. "It will take all the wealth of this hidden city to make the first payment on your ransom." Calmly, the youthful Lama studied Kron, then smiled as though ready to accept whatever fate decreed. Kron responded with a glare, then swung to view the others in the same ugly fashion. "I'll soon decide what to do with the rest of you," Kron began. "In fact—" He paused as a heavy rap sounded on the golden door. "I'll decide right now, because Hurdu's men are back. Let them in, Hurdu." Hurdu turned and opened the door. As he did, he came flying back as though a tornado had hit him. Hurdu's gun scaled from his hand as he landed hard and flat. The one man still with Hurdu was jumping in to help him, only to be sprawled in the same efficient fashion. Now, Biff saw the man with the double-barreled fists who had played the part of a human whirlwind. Biff raised a shout that the other boys echoed. "Muscles!" Chapter 21. Secret of the Snows. Bela Kron, though standing ready with his gun, was caught flat-footed by the speed and power that Muscles showed. Kron was a crack shot, but he had to wait until Hurdu and the other husky guard were out of the way before he could open fire. In his eagerness to concentrate on Muscles, Kron forgot 2 others. Those 2 were Thomas Brewster and Charles Keene. Knowing exactly how far Muscles would carry his drive, Biff's father and uncle acted accordingly. At the crucial moment, they launched a double drive of their own. Kron, coming to deliberate aim as Muscles hulked up as a target, was suddenly overwhelmed before he could pull the trigger of his gun. Excitedly, Biff and the other boys were pointing to the outer room, where more figures were appearing, but Muscles motioned for them to be calm. Then, through the doorway, came Tix and half a dozen of his Ladakhi crew. Amiably, Muscles waved them out, saying, "Never mind, boys, you won't be needed." The men from Leh realized suddenly that they were in the presence of the Chonsi Lama, and that in itself accomplished results. Bowing low, they backed out through the golden doors. Gravely, the Chonsi Lama returned their bows until they were gone. Then he turned to Biff and said, "If you introduce your friend Muscles, I will grant him an audience. Then he can tell his story of how he turned the tables." Biff introduced Muscles, who responded characteristically. "Everything's under control," he said, "so I can take time out to talk. It seems like talking is getting to be the best thing I do. Those Sherpas we landed among thought I was what they called a Yeti, but I talked them out of it. Then they were so glad they were ready to do anything I wanted, so I talked them into coming over this way and catching up with the party that was on its way here, just on the chance I might be needed. We tried to take a shortcut, and whom did we run into?" Muscles turned to Biff. "Your whole crew of porters heading back to Leh. When they told me they'd been seeing Yeti tracks, I figured somebody had been faking them." "Somebody was," returned Biff. "Hurdu." The Chonsi Lama was becoming more and more intrigued. He expressed the eagerness felt by all the boys when he suddenly urged, "Go on, Muscles. Tell us more." "Well, Your Honor," Muscles resumed, suddenly impressed by the youthful Lama's robe, "I did some more talking to Tix and his friends. I told them that there weren't any such thing as Yetis, and that having been mistaken for one, I was somebody who should know. So they turned right round and came along with me. Then, to convince them further, I rigged myself up in an old yak hide and wrapped old towels around my shoes so I could scare Hurdu and his tribe into thinking they were really looking at a Yeti. and not just footprints. "So you were the thing we saw go bounding up the ledge!" exclaimed Biff. "That's right," said Muscles. "I kept on going, too, clear up beyond a big rock pile." Chandra turned to Biff. "You see, I was right." "It was dark when I started out," continued Muscles, "so I brought a rifle with me. I'd left it behind the rock pile, and when I saw you tangling with that big bear, I up and clipped him, first shot. There was other shooting coming from down your way, so I had my chance to clear out, and did." "And you followed us from then on?" queried Biff. "Sure did," returned Muscles. "We saw you go into the woods and disappear, so we did the same and found the steps that brought us down here. They let us in when I said I was with you, Biff, so I guess you're pretty important around here." "Biff is important here," declared the Chonsi Lama. "Very important." "I decided to take over," Muscles went on, "when we found a lot of Hurdu's men going down in the courtyard. We jumped them before they knew what to expect. They knew, though, when they got it. I came on up and ran into a couple of Hurdu's men coming down, so I bagged them and turned them over to my crew. Then I walked in here, and you saw the rest." It was time now for the Chonsi Lama to hold a conference with his advisors, so he politely bowed his visitors and rescuers out. On the way down from the throne room, Biff said to Muscles, "So you don't believe there are such things as Yetis?" "I didn't when I came here," returned Muscles, "but after one look at this place, I'm ready to believe anything." They left Bela Kron, Hurdu, and a few of his men in the custody of the palace guards, a dozen men in garish red and yellow uniforms, whose chief business was blowing trumpets, opening doors, and participating in ceremonies generally. The guards were armed with brass muskets that looked like models of ancient Chinese cannon and probably hadn't been fired since the day gunpowder was invented. The guards were good custodians, however, for the massive buildings forming the foundations of the slant-walled palace were honeycombed with secret passages and hidden cells. Escape was impossible, even for Bela Kron, the master spy, and his principal followers. As for the rest, they were simply Changpa tribesmen who had been coaxed in from remote Tibet by Hurdu, just as Muscles had brought in the visiting Sherpas from Nepal. By now, Sherpas and Changpas were becoming friends, rather than one group having the other in its charge. The Ladakhi, too, were fraternizing with both groups and were all so overwhelmed by the importance of the Chonsi Lama that they were ready to follow his commands. So they were given the freedom of the fabulous city until the time should come for them to return to their native climes. Mr. Brewster sat in on the conferences held by the Chonsi Lama and his advisors, with Charles Keene an occasional participant in the deliberations. During breaks in the session, they chatted with Biff and the other boys, who were lodged in special guest quarters with Muscles. When the previous Lama died, Mr. Brewster stated, he saw to it that his successor would be educated in modern ways as well as those of ancient days. Your friend, the young Lama, had an English tutor and is versed in other modern languages as well. He is now just 16 years old and has 2 more years to go until he is of age. The 2 men you saw with him were the acting regent and the prime minister, who have been keeping Chonsi as it was until the new Grand Lama takes full power. But now that the Raja's ruby has been returned to become again the light of the Lama, they have decided that this is their day of decision. All agree that Chonsi no longer should be the lost city. That became official the next day. The natives of Chonsi were told that they were free to visit the outer world without restriction. The Chonsi Lama entrusted Mr. Brewster with the state dispatches to be taken to New Delhi, so that the boundaries of tiny Chonsi could be defined and its status determined through international negotiations. Bela Kron, Hurdu and a few others were to be turned over to the government of India, as they were wanted for crimes committed within the jurisdiction of that nation. Biff and the boys had a last pleasant visit from the Chonsi Lama and then were on their way. All Chonsi was out to wave farewell to the departing visitors. From the distance came booming sounds like a parting salute, but not from guns. Those were the reverberations from the crashing masses of rock and ice that so frequently toppled from the granite walls that flanked this narrow land, the place of living thunder. All the porters and native tribesmen made the return climb from the mile-deep chasm and back through the mountain passes beyond. There were no serious incidents along the way, as the expedition no longer was troubled with plotters such as Bela Kron and Hurdu. Instead of returning to Leh with the Ladakhi, Biff and his father and the rest of the party continued south to the ranges where the Sherpas lived. There, Charles Keene and Muscles put the plane in flying order, and after a few pleasant days in the fertile valley, the first group took off for New Delhi. Charles Keene was at the controls. With him were Mr. Brewster, Biff, Chandra and Kamuka, all of whom would give first-hand evidence concerning the double dealings of the notorious Bela Kron. Charles Keene was then to fly back to the Sherpa Valley and pick up Muscles, Lee, Chuba and Mike Arista to bring them on to New Delhi, where all the boys would meet again. But as the plane climbed high above the mountain pass, thoughts of a more immediate reunion flashed through Biff's mind and brought an anticipatory smile to his lips. By the time they reached New Delhi, Biff's mother would be there from Darjeeling with the twins. Eyes half closed, Biff could already picture the eager faces of Ted and Monica as his brother and sister waited breathlessly to hear the full story of his latest adventures. End of chapter 21. Recording by Peter Thomlinson. End of Mystery of the Ambush in India by Andy Adams.